Hello, church. I am not able to be with you this morning. Kristen and the kids and I got home what will be for you last night, but for me is tonight. We got home tonight at 7:30 on the dot, and at 7:31 and a half, I tested positive for COVID. I did not know why I was feeling so crummy the last 48 hours. And then, on the drive home, I thought, I think I have COVID. So I tested, and I do. And look, I thought about just wearing a mask and just coming, but powering through. But there's a there's a lot of microphone sharing that I want to be careful about, and then there's also this fear that kind of crept in my mind, which is like, what if somebody gets COVID? What if somebody even I'm not around gets COVID? But it kind of gets attributed to me since everyone knew I kind of wasn't feeling well. And what if this person were older and weren't in the top shape of life and they got really sick, and then people were like, you know how they got it, right? The preacher came to church with COVID. And I just don't want that. And you don't want that. It's not a good look to for the preacher to be spreading COVID. So look, this is no one's favorite way. This is certainly not my favorite way. I wish I was there. I hate talking to a camera. I'm not any good at it. And I doubt it's your favorite way to hear a sermon. But in light of that, I'd like to make this short. But I don't want to skip it because we've got ground to cover in First Peter, and we've got some important ground to cover today. And I'm going to try to just get in the essentials. I need to go back and talk about two words we've already talked about, and then introduce two new words today for us to kind of be able to make progress. Now, we're going very slowly through First Peter, but that's because so far, First Peter has been two sentences. There's the greeting, and then there's the long run-on sentence, which we're currently in the original language. And we're not even done with that second sentence yet. So first, our Peter packs in all this dense theology at the beginning here, and we've got to kind of go slow before we can go fast. So I want to go back, and I want to talk about this word predestination. Predestination is a theological term that gets a lot of people tripped up. Some have taught poorly, I think, that predestination means that God knew all things from the beginning of time, and so God knew who would be saved from the beginning of time and who wouldn't. And on one hand, that makes sense because God's all-knowing. On another hand, it's kind of like, then what's the point of this whole life thing if God already knows? Why try to be good if I'm not one of the predestined? I don't think that's what First Peter means. First Peter gets translated predestination, but really it's two words that are kind of on opposite sides of this sentence that I've been talking about that kind of get shoved together. So the first word gets, in the original language, gets attached to this phrase I keep mentioning, the exiles of dispersion. The actual language is the chosen exiles of dispersion. So chosen is this first of two words that kind of gets made into predestined. But here's what I think. As we've noted, the exiles of dispersion is the language that God is using for his covenant people, the Israelites, as they're in exile. And now First Peter is using it for these Christians in ancient Asia Minor who have chosen God. God chose the Israelites. These Gentiles chose God. And Peter's saying it's not the Israelites that are God's chosen people anymore. It's the church. It's the covenant people of God who have said yes to following Jesus. God chose these people from the foundations of the earth to be the church at this time. I think that's really beautiful. I think the chosen exiles of dispersion, if we can apply to ourselves also, makes me think that when being a Christian is hard, we've got this. We can do this because God thinks that we're up for the challenge. God thinks we're the right people for the job. We are the chosen exiles of dispersion, here to transform our communities for Christ. That's the first word, chosen. The second word is this foreknowledge, that God has this foreknowledge to sanctify you from the beginning. And again, that's just this language that Peter's using to talk about the specific instance in which they find themselves. Which leads us to the new word. So we've got chosen, exiles of dispersion, foreknowledge, and here's the new word, testing. Let me read it as it was read to you earlier. Be happy about this, even for a little while you must suffer all kinds of trials. The quality of your faith far more valuable than gold, which though perishable is tested by fire. I think we have like this education system that makes us associate somewhat tricky language on tests. Sometimes tests are trying to trick you. And we've kind of applied that to this theological idea of testing, that God's trying to trick us. Or we say, oh, God is testing me today, as if like I need to have an extra bit of patience with somebody. Whenever we talk about God's testing, it's kind of this mysterious thing. But 1 Peter doesn't talk about testing that way. This trial, this testing is specific. It is the foreknowledge, the chosen exiles of dispersion, that this testing, these are the right people for the job. And what is the specific test? Well, the full-blown Christian persecution of the first century has not happened yet. It's not going to happen for about another 30 years. It is not yet physically dangerous to be a Christian. It's emotionally dangerous. It's hard. One of the commentaries I read this week said that the ancient Romans were tolerant of everything except for somebody who was intolerant. They did not care which God you worshiped. They did not care how you worshiped that God, who you hurt in the process of worshiping that God, especially if you're a wealthy male. And they're just fine with all of it, unless you're somebody out there who's saying, I don't think you should be doing that. And that's how the first century church is really seen. They're seen as intolerant. They're seen as rejecting family gods. Last week we talked about inheritance. The new Christians who are receiving this letter almost certainly lost all of their inheritance the moment that they confessed Christ. And when you think about living in the first century world where there's no social safety net, there's no welfare system, there's no a hospital to take care of you if you get sick. If you have your inheritance cut, you have your lifeline cut. If you can't work for your father, or if you lose your bad name because your father's disowned you, you can't work for his friends, you don't have a way to get income. And so the first century Christians, the original audience of this letter, they're hurting. They're going through extremely difficult trials. They are not yet being arrested and thrown into the lion's den, but having your family disown you would be hard. That's a trial. Having all of your friends want nothing to do with you, that would be hard. This is the cost that these Christians are calculating to follow Christ. This is the test. God isn't trying to trick us when we are being tested. Satan is the father of lies, and so God can have no part of deception or deceiving. God's testing is straightforward, and God's testing is always for you. It is always loving, which gets us to our last word. Peter says, let me just continue where I left off. While you must suffer all kinds of trials, the quality of your faith, far more valuable than gold, which though perishable is tested by fire, results in the praise and glory and honor in the revelation of Jesus the Christ. Although you didn't see him, you love him. And though you don't see him now, you believe in him and are glad with the inexpressible and glorious joy, since you win the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Salvation is the last word. It comes from this word salvos, which means to make whole. There is a future component, which is what we tend to focus on, the future component of salvation. There's a healthy debate about whether or not salvation will be a universal salvation. God will, in the end, save all things, or if God's salvation will be limited to those who are faithful in this lifetime. But what I want to focus on today is not the future component, but the existing component. And the way I'll read it again, the way Peter talks about it is both a future and a present tense. Although you didn't see him, you love him. And though you don't see him now, you believe in him and are glad with the inexpressible and glorious joy, since you win the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Salvation, salvos, means to make whole. And again, in the future, will God make all things whole again? Or God will make limited things whole? But these people were thinking about the future and the present tense. And so there's a way in which this testing, this specific testing, is for the salvation of their souls now. God is making them whole through this testing. The purpose of the testing is not a mystery. It's straightforward, the salvation of their souls. God's testing is, again, always for you, always loving you, always trying to make you whole. So I'll close with this story. There was a preacher who was retiring, and a good friend gave him a month in the mountains to go relax and to meditate on his career service. And this preacher was very successful. He baptized a lot of people. He had a large following. By every metric, he was a successful person. It took him a while, but he got quiet and still. And he was just overtaken by this retreat, the beauty of the mountains and the spring, the blossoming of the flowers and the bumblebees and the hummingbirds. It was beautiful. But after a while, he found himself becoming angry because every time he slowed down, he was brought to mind his son, who we would probably describe as a prodigal. The preacher was successful. He reached a lot of people, but he could not reach this person closest to him. And they had a lot of contentiousness. They had a hard relationship. And the preacher says, I got so angry at God. I saw all these beautiful birds and these flowers and these bumblebees. And I said, God, you know every beat of that bumblebee's wings. You know every beat of the hummingbird's heart. You know how the teeth line up in my mouth. You know how the blood pumps through my veins. You know every bush and shrub and flower and plant that I can see. Why haven't you made clear to me how to reach my son? And God said, or the wisdom that returned to him, was, oh, you know what to do. You've always known what to do. Pick up the phone. Apologize. Tell him that you love him. Tell him that you've always loved him, even though you haven't always expressed it perfectly. Tell him that there's nothing he can do to make you stop loving him. And the preacher said, when my son answered the phone, I felt my soul become a little more whole. When he listened to me without interrupting, and when we didn't yell at each other, it was made a little bit more whole still. And when he called me back on his own a month later, and we talked, I knew that this testing God was giving me was making my life more whole and my son's life more whole, and that God was saving our souls in the present tense. I don't know what the answer to every test is. I have a suspicion that it might be love. That every testing you go through, every testing that I go through, we don't need to be confused. God isn't confusing. God is trying to make our hearts grow, and that's painful sometimes. It is truly difficult to call someone and apologize, to be the person who goes first. It takes a lot of humility. But I'm wondering if you're going through a testing right now, is there a way in which expanding the capacity for love to be in the situation I wonder if that might help. God, who loves us beyond measure, who loves us so much, he sent his one and only Son, not to condemn the world, but to save us, to bring us closer to him. God always loves. As we go through 1 Peter, the challenge, the specific testing that we're going to get into, Peter's going to ask people to do hard things. They're almost always characterized by this expanding of loving someone who's being awful to you. So, Northside, I really hate not to be there today. I hope this hasn't been too painful for you. I pray that if you feel tested at some point this week, you would remember to ask yourself, can I increase my capacity to love this person? And how might that help? Until next week, may the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you into the wilderness, protect you in the storm, and bring you home rejoicing at all the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again to these doors. Love you.